Hello everyone, this is Greg Tong, Vice President of Management Roundtable. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's webinar, which is entitled Design Thinking, Extreme Customer-Driven Innovation. Our presenters today will be Matt Belge, who's President of Vision and Logic, a Boston-based firm focused on user experience design, and John Carter, a principal at TC Gen Inc., which is located in Menlo Park, California. Today, Matt and John will be walking us through the concepts and implementation of design thinking, which is an approach to innovation that's centered around discovering a very deep understanding of customer needs and behaviors and finding the breakthrough idea that results in unique and winning solutions. John and Matt will also be leading a seminar on this subject in Boston this October. There'll be more information on that at the end of the presentation. Before we do begin, I have a few quick housekeeping items that I need to cover. They are important. Each of you should have received via email the details of viewing the webinar inside a web browser. That means that you have not installed this add-on. To install that add-on, you should see a phone icon in the upper toolbar of your browser screen. When you click on that, you'll follow the prompts that say connect to your computer, and that will take you through the process of installing the Adobe add-in. Once the program has concluded, we will be emailing to everyone a link to an online evaluation form where we'd appreciate it if you could take the time to fill that form out and give us your feedback on today's session and give us any suggestions you have for future events as well. When you get that email, we'll also be giving you a link to where you can download a PDF copy of today's slide presentation. During today's session, you all have the opportunity to ask questions of our presenters. You don't have to wait for a pause to ask the question. You can do so at any time by typing their question into the Q&A window inside the chat framework that you see in front of you, and we will announce your questions into this session. And some we may not get to right away, and we'll try to hold those to the end, but we'll try to get as many questions in as we can. Let us begin with today's session. Once again, our presenters are Matt Belge, President of Vision and Logic, joining us from Boston, and John Carter, Principal at TC Gen Inc., joining us from Menlo Park. Matt is a recognized leader in the field of user experience design, which is a field that pioneered many of the methods now used in design thinking. And John Carter has founded and led many different companies and is a well-respected advisor to technology firms. For more in-depth information on their backgrounds, you'll find their bios on the Management Roundtable website. Today's subject, design thinking, is generally considered the ability to combine empathy for the context of a problem, creativity in the generation of insights and solutions, and rationality to analyze and fit solutions to the context. It combines a number of techniques to help you peel back the layers of a product or service and aim your approaches to innovation at the heart of the customer's needs. Matt and John will be helping us sort through this concept and provide some practical structures on how to manage this different approach to creativity and product development. And with that, I'll turn the call right over to Matt and John.
Thank you very much, Greg. This is Matt, and on behalf of John and myself, I welcome you to our presentation. I'd like to get started right away. I'm going to start out by telling you a story that has to do with design thinking. And it's about a man named Doug Dietz who worked for General Electric, helping to design and implement an MRI machine. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with these MRI machines. You're seeing a photograph of one now. And if you've ever been involved in an MRI, you know that it can be a somewhat intimidating experience. Well, in the case of Doug Dietz, his team had just designed this machine for General Electric, and it was a big success. They were selling well. The imaging capabilities were very good, and all in all, it was a great product that was well received. But Doug wanted to dig a little deeper and just really understand more about the machine. And so he asked if he could visit some hospitals and watch it actually in use. And while he was there, he happened to see a little girl about 7 years old being led to the MRI machine. In one hand, she held her mother's hand, and in another hand, she held And so afterwards, he asked one of the radiologists about that. And they told him that more than 80% of the children who come to use an MRI machine need to be sedated. And the reason is because they're afraid of the machine. They find it intimidating and scary. Well, at that moment, Doug declared himself a failure. He felt horrible about the whole thing. He didn't care how well the machine was selling. He felt very deeply that he needed to fix this. And so what he did is he put together a team of cross-functional members that included such disciplines as working with people who design children's museum exhibits. And he also worked with child psychologists. And he worked with the radiologists, that is, the customers themselves, the people who run the machines. And he actually worked with kids. They had kids as part of their team. And together they brainstormed ideas. They made sketches of ways to try and make the MRI experience less intimidating for children. And they even did things like going into the hospital and getting down on their knees and walking around at that level to see the hospital from a child's perspective. And when they did that, they could understand the intimidation a lot better and why children found it so fearful. And what they came up with was this. You can now see, hopefully, an image that shows the same MRI machine that's been transformed into a pirate ship. The platform that the patient would be laying down on is the plank, as in walking the plank on a pirate ship. And the opening of the MRI machine has been transformed by the use of paint and coloring to look like the steering wheel of a ship. And if you look closely, you'll see that the walls have been painted as well. And as it turns out, the entire environment had been reconsidered to make it more like an adventure ride than like a MRI machine. For example, they even had one version which was a koi pond type of thing. And on the floor, they painted the stones of a koi pond. And they actually observed kids coming into the room, jumping from stone to stone and telling their parents they had to do the same thing. So here's an image now showing a little boy who's coming into the MRI machine, and he's going to the pirate adventure. As you can see, he's actually got a pirate hat, and he's carrying a backpack with him. And in that backpack are different artifacts that were given to him as part of the so-called adventure that he was going on. He got a booklet that was about the pirate's adventure, and he got other keepsakes and mementos that made the whole thing feel more like a ride at Disneyland than like a trip to the hospital. And here's a picture of that little boy entering into the MRI machine. It's now transformed into a pirate's adventure. And as they worked on this, as I mentioned, they came up with a lot of different ideas for what the MRI machine might be conceived as. Here's a different one that they called the Jungle Adventure. As again, you can see not only has the machine itself been transformed, but the entire environment has been transformed. They even went so far as to create sounds and smells that would be part of the environment. So, for example, they talked about creating a sort of rainy smell after the sort of smell you smell after it's been raining to reinforce a rainforest jungle kind of feeling. And one day when, after this work had been done, Doug was at the hospital and he observed a little girl who had just been through the MRI, and as she got out of the MRI, she jumped up and she said to her mom, "Can we do that again tomorrow? Can we come back?" And at this point, Doug actually started to break down and had a few tears in his eyes because he felt that he'd solved the problem and he was very happy about it. And when he looked over, he saw one of the X-ray technicians, and she was crying too. And then he thought maybe he was in trouble because he'd made a customer cry. So after the session was over, he had a chance to go back and talk to the technician. And she said, "Oh, no, there was nothing wrong with that at all. I was crying because it reminded me of why I came into children's medicine in the first place." And the message that I hope you're getting from this is that a deep involvement, like Doug had with his customers, combined with a cross-functional team, are the kinds of things that can be done to do design thinking and make a transformational experience. I should also point out that it was a huge business success. Hospitals started calling General Electric, and they were no longer asking for the machine by number. They were asking for it by ride. That is, can we get the Jungle series, or can we get the Pirate series? And the sedation rate, which I mentioned earlier, was at 80% for children, dropped so low that it was almost at 0. Kids were no longer needing to be sedated to go into this machine. So this leads me to our topic for today. What is design thinking? Well, there's a bunch of ways that it can be defined. I'll try and just keep it simple. I would say that one aspect of design thinking is that it brings out the designer in everyone. I think all of us have had experiences when we were kids where we would sketch with crayons and play with clay, and it was a very creative feeling. And as too often is the case, as we grew up, we sort of lost the way with that. Design thinking is meant to put you back in touch with that kind of inner child and use that creativity to help solve problems in a better and more innovative way than you would otherwise. It's also about getting a deep understanding of the customer. And we talked about Doug Dietz and how he got down at knee level and walked around at child's height level to see. That kind of thing is very much a part of design thinking. You might ask, well, why is this important? Well, it turns out that if you start walking around in somebody else's shoes for a little while, those shoes might be very different than the kind of shoes that you wear, and you'll start seeing things from a very different perspective. And it's when we see things from a different perspective that we start to get these innovative ideas. Put another way, design thinking will help you get to the why of a question. Many of the marketing methods that have been developed for creating new products are terrific, but they mostly help you with what. That is, what needs to be done. If you can get to the why, you'll have a much deeper understanding of what it is you're trying to do, and as a result, have an opportunity to get to some breakthrough ideas that you might not have been able to do so otherwise. We have developed a methodology for design thinking. This methodology borrows methods from quite a few disciplines and quite a few contributors over the years. Some of you will look at this and you may say, well, you know, I've done some of these things before, so what's new here? And what I would say is, well, many of us have run a mile, and many of us have done some training, but how many of us have actually trained and then done a mile? It's a big difference when you have the focus ahead of time about what you're going to do, and then you execute based on that focus. So if you have this framework, the framework we're going to outline today, we hope it will give you a better sense of what's coming ahead and how the work that you did behind it will help back up what you're going to do in the future. So there are 7 steps, as we like to describe it, and I'll just briefly mention them, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, John Carter, who's going to describe the first step. So the steps are, going from the top of the page, seed, and then research, and then ideate, and then distill, and then prototype, and then evaluate, and then iterate. In the course of our conversation, our presentation today, we're going to take you through each of these steps and explain a little bit more what each one means. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Carter, who will walk you through the seed section of this methodology. John?
Hi, Matt. Thanks for the introduction, and I'm glad to be part of this. Next 5 minutes or so to share some of my thoughts on the seed stage. When Matt asked me to participate, he asked me what my favorite design thinking stage was, and I picked the first stage, the seed stage. Why? Because I felt it's the most important. You know, it's funny. Why do you think that some design thinking teams rush through this stage? Because it's hard. It's not fun. Problem solving's fun. Defining the problem isn't. My goal is to help you understand why it's significant and how you can learn a few things in the seed stage. If we look at this first element in the seed stage, I wanted to get you oriented with a timeline showing the beginning part of the process. 5 simple, short steps that can take 1 to 2 weeks typically, but can be done in a day or 2 or as much as long as it takes to do the proper research. Starts with clarifying the problem and the team, and then the optional stage is further research if required to further define the problem. And then briefing the team prior to kickoff, and I'll tell you why that's important in just a moment. And then the kickoff itself. In thinking about this seed stage, the parable or notion that go slow in the beginning to go fast at the end is appropriate. Now, defining the problem is key. Open-ended questions that are broad, simple, jargon-free, and future-oriented are key. For example, how can we improve the on-the-ground experience of our airline customers? How can we improve the employee work environment? How can we create an environment that supports innovation? These are deep questions and deep problems. And here I think the illustrative point was made by Charles Kettering, an automotive pioneer. A problem well stated is half solved. If we look at the next stage, element here in the seed stage, one of the key points is after the problem is defined and frankly, after the team is chosen, we want to alert the team to the problem definition before the first session of the kickoff. Many of you may be aware of Christian Turwich's and Carl Ulrich's work. They're both University of Pennsylvania professors, wrote the book Innovation Tournaments and many other papers. And they found that allowing individual processing time before brainstorming gets you more and better ideas. The typical brainstorming process gets everybody in a room to solve the problem. But they found that the outcome has 30% higher quality ideas as judged by an industry panel for the trials that they did, and 3 times the raw number of ideas if you do a hybrid process of allowing people notification of the problem be solved before you start any group processes. So in fact, this alerting the team to before is a best practice that can be applied here at the seed stage and in other best practices. The outcome that I described is important because one of the things that we look at in terms of choosing the team, and in choosing the team we have notions of leadership buy-in, peers that are all equal even if they're drawn from different levels of the company, that it's cross-functional and deeply collaborative. Unlike a typical team where different people work on different problems, here we urge everybody in design thinking to work on all the problems. And this is one of the best practices as well that we encourage in design thinking. Moving forward to the next chart here, how is this different than a typical project? How are these teams different? I think one of the most singular differences is that the sponsor participates in the project team itself. And as one of my clients said, the most empowered teams act as mini companies with all functions represented as would be in a real company and a broad charter with deep accountability. And that's true in design thinking as well. And sponsor participation throughout the life cycle ensures its success. If we look at the guidelines for defining the problem, there's a number of points here that all illustrate the notion and importance of creating a solution-free problem. And an example of this is if you look at an automotive company, automotive accessories company that's losing market share, one problem statement could be, how can we develop the next generation radar detector? A much better problem statement would be, how can we help our customers avoid moving violations? Clearly you can see that it's not only solution-free and doesn't pick a radar technology, but it also broadens the thinking to other product categories besides simply radar speed detection. Also, guidelines for solving the problem include those around cost and time. For example, if you look at trying to define the problem, the most, I would say, creativity-sucking elements are time limitations and cost limitations. So the goal in providing your problem statements would be to eliminate those creativity-sucking constraints of budget and time. And one of my associates, Fred Hume, CEO of a test and measurement company, once said when a team complained they didn't have enough money, that if the idea is really good enough, any bank will finance it. And that's true in design thinking as well. Come up with a good idea and apply the constraints later. And if we conclude with this section, what I'd like to do is simply highlight the key conclusions. To recap, problem well stated is half solved. Secondarily, hybrid brainstorming yields 30% better ideas and 3 times the raw number compared to traditional group brainstorming. So ensure that your problem statement is solution-free, and don't choke your creativity by constraining the solution's time or cost. Matt, the research stage is all yours.
Thanks, John. That was fabulous. So I'm now going to take you through the next stage. You just heard about the seed stage from John Carter. We're going to talk now about the research stage in the methodology. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with research as an important function in doing any kind of product development. But I hope if you'll listen carefully, you'll hear that we have a few twists on that. I'm going to start by telling you a couple of stories. Before I tell those stories, let me just say that a key concept throughout this research section is that everyone participates in the research. As much as possible, literally everybody is there for every research session. And you might ask why, and the reason is because you're trying to build a common shared knowledge and common shared experience. And by doing that, the team is much better equipped. A number of years ago, I was fortunate enough to get the chance to work on software to support the call center for Swissair. This is when people call in and they want to book a flight. And typically, people who call in are booking very complex flights, things that can't just be done over the website. So the passenger care center, to be clear, is not the call center. The passenger care center is where they manage all of the planes that the airline flies. And if you look carefully, you can see that some of the people at these desks have 3, 4, and even 5 computer screens on their desks. What that's all about is they're literally keeping track of all the aircraft in real time. If it's in the air, if it's on the ground, if they suddenly realize that they don't have enough planes in Munich or that a plane is going to be late in arriving to London, it's this group that actually manages the fleet in live and in real time. You only get to go into this room by going through a bunch of security checks. It's behind the scenes at an airport. It's the kind of place where most people wouldn't get to, but we were privileged to go there. And one of the things we saw was a room off to the side, this dark room, and inside there were a whole lot of telephones and places for people to sit, and the room was empty. It turns out that that was the room that was used for trauma and crisis centers. That is, when a severe situation such as an airplane crash or other tragedy occurred, it was all hands on deck and people went into that room to manage the tragedies. Now, happily, that hasn't happened in many years and hopefully won't happen again in many years. But my point is that when you're in that room, just looking around, you can feel the emotion and the importance of what an airline is all about. Safety doesn't become just a word anymore. You understand that people's lives are at stake, and that precision is important, and that caring and being empathetic to the passengers is important. And designing software that will do those things suddenly becomes a lot more real. The other story I want to tell you is one about what's called extreme users, and that's where you see the Boston firefighters on the right. This was a project that I did for a large financial services client, and in this case, we were trying to solve the problem of how can we improve the workplace environment for people. And the concept of extreme users is one that was originated from Stanford's D School. And the basic idea of extreme users, it's not the same thing as an advanced user. If you've heard the concept of advanced user, that's the idea of someone who's just become an expert in how to use your product. An extreme user is not that. An extreme user is someone who comes at your problem, your service, your product from a very different angle than what the average person would. In this case, the firefighters represent an extreme angle because their workplace environment is where they actually live. They live together 24/7. And so we took a team, and you can see there's a whole bunch of people there interviewing. This is the entire cross-functional team that's trying to solve that problem. And they're interviewing a bunch of Boston firefighters. And we learned a lot of really great things. For example, they all cook together. And they pitched in together and bought exercise equipment so that they could all work out together. And we saw the rooms where they actually sleep. And we learned that they had pets that they raised together, cats and dogs. And what was really clear in between the lines as they talked about how they worked together was how deep and trusting they were of each other. They kidded each other, they made jokes, and they sort of poked fun at each other. But there was a kind of deep at ease that they had at one another. And when you think about it, their lives are literally at stake, and they're placing their lives in the hands of others. So that level of trust is something that's very important to firefighting. And there wasn't a single person who didn't come away from that meeting, from that interview, with a different perspective about, wow, wouldn't it be great if we could create a workplace environment that had those kinds of qualities? And once again, without physically being there and physically breathing in the atmosphere, I don't think we could have achieved it.
Matt, we have a quick question. Someone's
Sure.
asking if the term extreme user is the same meaning or maybe similar to what Eric von Hippel at MIT calls the lead user.
No, I'm not familiar with Eric's work, so I can't comment. I would say, based on what I know, that the idea of an extreme user, again, is someone who represents a radically different perspective on what your what you're trying to solve. And they may not, in fact, be your customer. They may never be your customer, but they have a very different point of view, and that point of view is really, is relevant to what you're doing.
Okay, it does sound very similar, but it's from a different school. So.
Okay, well, thanks. I'd like to dig into that a little more. I'm going to give another example in a second. So what I want you to understand about research, as I said earlier, is everyone goes out together. You do this as much as possible. Now, I know that many companies have research experts, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't make use of them and have to help them guide you. But too often what happens is the research team goes out on its own, does the research, comes back, and gives a report. And that's a very different feeling than what I'm talking about. It's a very different experience than what I'm talking about. So let your research team help you get this deeper understanding. That's what we're trying to say. Favor qualitative research. The design thinking approach is one that's human-centered. I'm not saying that there's anything bad with quantitative, that is statistical information, but in this kind of design work and this kind of thinking, getting deep into the customer's head is best done through qualitative methods, actually talking to them. The object is to gain empathy with these people. Some techniques that can be used include things like what time and a group of customers are going to come in and you're going to talk to them. And your team has been pre-keyed to this idea, and they've put together some sort of an interview guide, questions that they're going to ask. And they spend something like 45 minutes with an individual customer, asking questions, probing, trying to get a better idea of the problem that they're trying to solve from the customer's point of view. And they might talk to 4 or 5 customers, in the course of a couple hours that way. Street interviews are sort of the same idea, except literally you just go out on the street and try and find people to talk to. The value of a street interview is it can be done spontaneously, whereas a lightning interview is something that has to be prearranged. And the extreme interviews that we talked about a minute ago, the Firehouse example, you saw that one. Occupy Boston, I'm sure many of you are maybe familiar with the Occupy movement. Well, it turns out that one of the financial service clients that I work with actually went out and interviewed people from Occupy Boston, because obviously they're going to have a very different perspective on the world of finance than people who are professional financial managers. And they came away with some very interesting and empathetic concepts. Among others, at least got a better sense of understanding why there is so much mistrust for some financial institutions in this country. Back to the concept of street interviews, which I mentioned earlier. Sometimes when we put teams together with knowledge ahead of time that they're going to be doing a design thinking session, we'll actually precede the street interviews by going and scouting out locations that we think are going to be fertile grounds for the kinds of questions that we think people might want to ask, and create a map and key up on the map, the locations and what's likely to be found there, and actually hand this to the participants as they go out and do their interviews. Once the interviews have been completed, the team's going to need to gather all the information and then try and make some sense of it. There's many techniques for this, but one technique that works well is to jot individual ideas on Post-it notes and then put them up on a wall in the following categories. One called environment, one called backstory, one called current methods, and one called future needs. So environment would be, what did you observe about the person's environment in the Firehouse, for example? What did you observe in that environment, including things like that they raise their own pets? Backstory is, tell us more about the person themselves. The problem that you're solving fits into a much larger context than just the fact that they're going to use your product. What's their backstory? What is it about them, and how does this fit in? Current methods are, how are they doing it today? However the problem is being solved for them today, they have some method, whether it's a good one, an awkward one, or a great one, and you want to understand that and capture information about what they're doing today. And future needs is about observations you make where something is clumsy or doesn't work as well as it could, or there's just a hole in the solution that they currently are using, something that's not really solving the problem. So you want to categorize those, and it's between the current methods and the future needs that you'll often come up with your best ideas for innovations for the future. Okay, so we've now covered the seed and the research portions of the methodology. I'm now going to take you on to ideate. So many of us have participated in brainstorming sessions, and I think among other things you've probably all been told that when you're doing brainstorming that you favor quantity over quality, and that you don't want to criticize ideas, that all ideas at this stage are good. But I don't know how many of you have actually heard a good explanation of why that's important. And it turns out Don Norman, who wrote a number of great books in the user experience field, has a great explanation in one of his books. And he talks about what he calls survival thinking versus what he calls creative thinking. So survival thinking is the kind of thinking that a person does, and our brains are hardwired for this. It's literally part of our survival. When you're in some kind of a threatening situation and your brain needs to shut down all functionality except to focus on the problem at hand. One example might be you're hungry, you really need to go find some food, you need to eat it right now, and if you've ever been in a working session where you're hungry, you know it's hard to concentrate because your brain is telling you to forget all that and get some food. Another, maybe more extreme example would be if you think about cavemen running around in the forest and a tiger leaps out. Well, tiger's a big problem, and you've got to solve that right away. You don't have time to think about looking at the blue sky. You don't have time to think about inventing fire. You need to survive the tiger. So all thought processes are shut down except for getting out of there or finding one way or another to get away from that tiger. Now, by comparison, creative thinking is a bit of the opposite. It's what we do when all of our needs are met, when we feel safe, and we can sort of daydream and go into blue sky mode. And the point I'm trying to make here is that if we're in this blue sky mode of creative thinking and suddenly something happens to threaten our survival, we're going to shut down that creative thinking in a blink of an eye and just switch into survival. And that this can happen when you're in a brainstorming session and you mention an idea and somebody else criticizes it. When that idea is criticized, it's very hard not to switch over to survival thinking, which is to say, oh, my job's being threatened here, I look incompetent, people will think I'm foolish. Any of those kinds of thoughts switches your brain into a survival thinking mode and shuts down creative thinking. So that's why it's important to support what some people would call silly or crazy ideas, to really foster a wide open creative aspect. Some techniques that can be used that you may not have heard of before is one that is called How Can We? And this again also came from the Stanford D School. The idea of how can we is to reimagine the problem from almost the opposite perspective of how a person might normally think about it. So an example would be, how can we make editing documents fun? Or, how can we make a call to tech support the best part of a customer's day? The point I'm trying to make here is neither of these things, documents creation is normally not thought of as fun. Calling tech support is not exactly something you usually want to do or that you look forward to. But if you twist it around like that, you start getting ideas that you might not otherwise have come up with. Another technique can be used is what's called adding extra dimensions. So for example, if you're trying to solve a problem, you could say, well, what would Michelangelo do if he tried to solve this problem? Or, suppose you could only do this once in your life. And when you start looking at the problem from these very different perspectives like this, ideas start to pop up that wouldn't normally be there and help you get to more innovative ideas.
And we do have a question on is this process also applicable to business-to-business settings and how it may differ from that environment?
Oh, absolutely it applies to business-to-business. The thing I would say there is what you'd want to do is, if you can, try to put on your team some of your customers. And if you can't, if you can't get them dedicated to work with you, on an ongoing basis, at the very least what you want to do is use them in those early stages, like the research stages, so to have them come in and talk to you about, how your business serves their business and what aspects of it are working well and what aspects need improvement. I would say that in general, design thinking solves a very broad range of business problems and even problems that are not, strictly speaking, business. For example, a nonprofit might use these methods. A nonprofit organization might use them as well. Okay, if it's all right, I'm going to go on to the distill section of the presentation. So after you've done the ideation, you have generated a ton of ideas, and now the point is to try and focus on some of the better ideas and to help boil it down to something that you can start actually working on. A great technique, one also developed at Stanford, is what's called the position statement. The form of the position statement is as follows. You have a user description, and then a need, and then an explanation. So for example, a young, personable insurance agent just building his practice needs quick ways to verify prospects while on the road because opportunity often comes unexpectedly. That's one example. Another position statement. A dedicated mom with two very active teenagers needs an easy way to keep track of her dad's health because grandpa can't do it for himself, and there is so much at stake. The point I'm trying to make about these two examples is that hopefully you can feel the person and their need and the context of their need in these two statements. And they both actually come from real-life research that we've done. So for example, the young, personable insurance agent, this is someone we actually talked to, and if you ever met him, he's like one of the most likable guys you'd ever find. He is just building up his practice. He didn't have that many clients. And so he's on the road a lot, taking calls, going to visit people. And as he's doing that, things come up unexpectedly. He might be stopping off in a diner and meet someone that he didn't know he was going to meet, or get a call referring him to someone who might be a good prospect for him. But he also needs to be efficient with his time, so he needs to be able to verify these prospects while he's on the road. So that's the problem, and that helps set the context. The situation with the dedicated mom, she has an aging father, and the aging father's health is failing, and she needs ways to help him. But she's got a busy life herself. She's got two active teenagers, and so she's not going to be there night and day with her father. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about each. So a persona is where you take a sort of collection of people and you boil them down into one person who is a sort of archetype that represents all of those people. In this case, we talked about the insurance agent, so the persona might be named Nate New Agent. And you actually have a photograph that represents this person, and you'd have information about his environment and his backstory and current methods and so forth, just like we talked about in the information that you try to glean in your interview. And then we might have a persona called Abby Aging Parent. And same thing, you'd have a photograph for her and things about her environment, her backstory, how she's solving the problem today, and how she might better solve it in the future. A very different technique than one that I thought was really fabulous is to do what are called vision videos. I had the opportunity to do one of these with a large insurance company. In this case, what we did is we created a video based on early talkie movies called The Perils of Pauline, and we turned it into The Perils of Pauline Producer. And in this case, Pauline, the producer, is in the upper left corner, and she's getting a phone call from a distraught client in the lower right. The distraught client is worried about how she can make her insurance payments. But as it turns out, as she talks to the client and she goes on to use the new software system that's been built for her, Pauline discovers that not only does she not have to worry about making payments, but that she can actually borrow money from the insurance policy. When we did this, we actually used stock photography to represent the people in the story, and we had a live script, and we spoke live and recorded it on video to animate the entire sequence. Another technique for distilling ideas, many of you may have seen this, is to do what's called an idea map. And in the idea map, you have on the x-axis, that is the axis going up and down, the customer value. On the right, on the y-axis, you have business value. And you take ideas and you place them on Post-it notes onto this. And what you're looking for are ideas that are high in business value and high in customer value. Okay, I'm now going to move on to the prototype stage of our presentation of the method. So the prototyping stage is about just that, creating something that will embody the system you're trying to design. But what you're really looking for here in the prototyping stage is you're trying to prototype behaviors. One mistake we see people doing sometimes in prototyping is creating something that is just too high in fidelity. It's very polished and very elegant looking. But in the early going, what you want to do is just focus on what is the overall behavior of this thing and how would a person interact with it. There's a famous example where a number of doctors were coming up with a way to deliver medicine to patients through an injection. And they create a prototype by taping together a blackboard eraser and two magic markers. If you look in the right corner here, there's an image of a famous prototype called the Apple Knowledge Navigator. This is a video that Apple created in 1987, and I'd actually strongly recommend that if you have a chance afterwards, you go to YouTube and you can find this video. What it shows is a prototype and how a person would interact with it. In this case, the prototype is what you're seeing on the screen. A man comes in the door, and this is his computer of the future. The computer of the future has a person who looks kind of like a butler. The butler person speaks to the man and helps him organize his day, do things like rearrange his calendar, send out email messages, and attend to other aspects of his day. The whole thing was done as a movie to try and show what it would really be like to use this future system. And I think what's fabulous about it is those of you who are familiar with Siri and the iPhone 4, or 4S, I guess I should say, will know that many of the ideas that were in the Knowledge Navigator have now manifest themselves in Siri of today. Some of the other techniques that have been used in prototyping include what's called Wizard of Oz. And the idea of Wizard of Oz is that someone plays the part of either the computer or the system you're interacting with. There's literally a human being does it. And the other part, the customer, is played by someone that you've brought in as an actual customer. And so they interact with a person who's pretending to be whatever that system is. It can be a very effective technique. I'm now going to move on briefly to talk about the evaluate section of design thinking. This is what happens after you've created some prototypes. So in the evaluate section, what you're all about is you're trying to learn how well your idea will really solve people's problems. And there are a lot of different ways to do this. There's home trials, and with that you would literally take your prototype and go into someone's home or whatever the environment is that they're going to use it. Some of you may know about what's called a usability test, and we have an image on the screen here of a usability test in progress. The way these typically work is you have a software system, and the user is given a task to perform, and it's recorded. That is, everything that they do recorded in video. You can see a picture-in-picture in the lower right corner of a person's face and what they're saying. And so once you have a chance to do this, you have a chance to understand not only what they clicked on, but why they clicked on it and what they're thinking as they go through the process. Once again, I can't stress enough how important it is for the entire team to be a part of this, because when you are all together observing a user actually trying to interact with your prototype, you get a much better shared experience than if one or two people do it and come back and report that to the rest of the group. Some other techniques that can be used include interviews and discussion groups. A discussion group, somewhat like a focus group, the idea is you have one or more of your prototypes and you bring in several customers. You tell them a little bit about the prototype and that you let them interact with it or respond to it or give you their feedback. And the point of doing it this way is that we have several people talking to each other. They'll often come up with ideas and conversations that are different than if you just talk to them one-on-one. Now I'd like to talk about the iterate section of design thinking. Jerry Lee Lewis recorded the fabulous song, Great Balls of Fire, in his very first take. Chances are your team isn't going to be that lucky. The point I'm trying to make is many teams go through some of these steps in design thinking, and they get to the iterate stage, and they don't iterate. Iterate is very important. You need to foster an environment that encourages iteration. You need to have the team understand that iteration is expected, and you need to very objectively understand what has been working well and what hasn't been working well and to improve those things. What new ideas have emerged as you went out and put out your prototype together? You need to refine the prototype. You need to make new plans. And overall, you need to be very objective and stepping back and not being attached to the problem. Not being attached to the solution, but only being attached to the problem and making sure that what you are creating is solving that problem and to improve it in areas where it needs to be improved. I'd like to tell you a story that many of you may already know, but it's about Steve Jobs and the iPhone. This comes from the Steve Jobs biography that was published earlier this year. Some of you may know that Apple created a number of prototypes on its way to creating what was to be the first iPhone. And you may also know that this was an extremely important product to Apple. Steve Jobs literally believed he was betting the company on the iPhone. Here are some examples of what some of the prototypes are that they considered. And here's what the iPhone looked like when it finally came out in its very first version. Now, it turns out that the product that they were going to ship looked a lot more like this image with squared off corners in the iPhone than the final version. And as it so happens, Steve Jobs sort of woke up in the middle of the night just as they were getting ready to ship the product and decided that he wasn't happy with it. Now, you have to understand that the product had already gone to manufacturing. The glass that was used for the face had been machined. The aluminum parts for the back of the phone had been machined. The circuit boards had been designed. It was all ready for manufacturing. And he decided that he wasn't happy, that it didn't have the sensual and emotional attachment that he wanted people to have with the iPhone. And so he essentially stopped the presses, told the team to keep working on it, and to come up with a new design. Among other things, what they designed, as you know, is this, which had, again, a much more sensual and emotive quality to it than the phone before. Well, obviously, that took a great deal of courage on Steve Jobs. In a culture that will support iteration and that understands that iteration is something that the team is going to do, and it's the only way to create really great, fabulous, innovative products. Now I'm going to just do a quick, brief summary of what we've talked about today in the design thinking methodology. We showed you the 7 steps, which were seed, research, ideate, distill, prototype, evaluate, and iterate. We often do this with clients in what's called a 1-hour lightning session. To be honest with you, it can be more like an hour to an hour and a half. But the point is, we have methods where you can go through the entire 7 steps in about an hour and a half. And then this can be followed up by a 2-day intensive where the team meets for 2 full days to go through these 7 steps in a little more meaningful way, in a little more detail, and come up with a real vision for what they're going to do. And then this can be followed up with what's called a 3-month vision development, where the idea is that the team is now, that it's gone through this 2-day intensive, is going to have 3 months to go through these same steps again, do iteration, do research, do prototyping, etc., and come up with a final vision of what the product really should be. In a moment, I'm going to open this up to questions. I want to thank you for participating. I want to mention that there is going to be a full workshop on this topic on October 29th and 30th in Boston. You will get information from Management Roundtable about that. We hope many of you would find it interesting to attend our workshop. But meanwhile, I hope you found the design thinking session today to be valuable. We think it's a fabulous set of techniques. I'd like to know if there are questions.
Just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, you can just type it right into the Q&A window that you see in the chat framework on your screen, and we'll announce the questions into the session. We have a question from before that relates to the research section, Matt, and it has to do with the street interviews. And someone wants to know, how do you know who you talk to on the streets will be one of the main customers, and how does such a convenient sampling lead you to a creative idea?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's the kind of question that often researchers, that is, trained researchers, would want to ask. It's the whole, if I may say, the concern behind a question like that is typically, am I getting a prejudicial sample? You know, I interviewed 3 people randomly. It happens to be 3 people who all hate whatever kind of product it is that I'm creating, and so I've gotten this biased input. And what I would say is that shouldn't be the only method that you use for verifying or getting feedback into your system, But the problem is that a lot of teams get zero feedback. They just essentially, breathing their own exhaust. They're not going out and talking to others. Another way, though, is that one of the great things about street interviews is you can often do 10 or 20 street interviews in a matter of 2 hours. And after you've done 10 or 20, the chances are that you've talked to a highly prejudicial sample. That goes down unless you happen to be in a location. I'm trying to think of one. You happen to be in the financial district in Boston, and everybody you talk to is a stock trader or a portfolio manager. There are those problems, but by and large, the method is compensated for because what you're really looking for is just to get perspectives besides your own.
Right, Matt, another question here. Can you use a field problem visit to conduct customer research? I guess is going to a customer to fix something an opportunity to do some of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we saw it earlier, you can go through the entire 7 steps in a matter of 1 or 2 hours. So if the team gets really skilled at that, they could do it. But most likely what we've used home visits for, or, following person around in their environment, is more for observation. So I'm not saying that it can't be done. It could be done, where you need to do it, as opposed to in your own office. But one of the great values of going to these other environments, let's say the person's home, is to absorb the whole ethos of that home and how what you're doing fits into it. And so I would say the best use of those kinds of visits is to do that. And maybe you could also do the entire cycle or portions of the cycle there. It would depend a lot on the context.
Okay. The last question was from Rich Marusenek, and the next question is from Felipe Gonzalez, and he asks, after using design thinking for a while, how long can it be before you start to see actual results, or how long the whole process can take with one project?
I wish I could give a good answer to that. There's a lot of variability, but as I mentioned in the presentation, if you set up a team with the idea that they're going to have 3 months to go through this, very often at the end of that time, you have a very, very good product vision. And it can even be done using agile methods and others that the team is going through these steps, and as they're going through their steps, they're starting to feed what I'll call the manufacturing or the development team with their ideas so that they are beginning to pour the foundation for the actual work. So the point I'm trying to make is this does not have to be done in a vacuum where the team is off on its own for 3 months or however long they've been chartered before the, shall we call it, development work can begin. A lot of the development work can begin as the new ideas are emerging, and let's say the implementation team is getting, constantly synced up and understanding what the team is thinking, and can use those ideas to start seeding, what they're going to need to do when they get into the full implementation phase. There's no one answer to that question. I believe Apple worked on the iPhone for something like 18 months. We've seen other, and which is pretty fast for a mobile device like that, but we've seen other teams do it in as little as a couple months. And as I said earlier, you can even do a 2-day session where the point of the 2-day session is just to get a clearer vision of what it is that the entire team is supposed to be doing and what problem you're solving and what possible solutions there are.
Okay, so your mileage may vary.
Yes.
We have another question here from Marianne Gillette, who asks, can you mention some online tools which might be useful for doing consumer research and co-designing with consumers?
There are a number of tools that will help you do online interviews, and off the top of my head, I'm spacing out on some of them. WebEx is one, but there's a few others. I'll see if I can put together a list after the fact. Online collaboration is not one of my specialties. I know others that do it, but there are a number of tools. WebEx is simply the idea of, I'm sure you're familiar with it in other video conferencing, web techniques, where the idea would be that you have the person right there in front of you, and using your camera, you can show them your ideas and solicit their feedback. But I know there are other tools, and it'll just take me a moment after we get off this presentation to put together a little collection of those for you.
Right, and from Vince, we have a question on at what step does any evaluation of the value proposition or the market size come into play to support moving a design idea forward?
Could you restate that, please?
It says, at what step does any evaluation of the value proposition or the market size come into play to support moving a design idea forward?
So the value proposition, I think, is always up for grabs during the design thinking. That is, you may come up with ideas that completely redo your value proposition. You may find that you have a whole new way of thinking about this that turns this into a game changer. When you come to things like, I'm going to ask John if he wants to chime in, John Carter, if he wants to chime in on this one. But when it comes to things like thinking about market share and so forth, remember we talked about the opportunities where we talk about evaluating the solutions from both a customer value standpoint and a business value standpoint. That's a reasonable place. That's essentially at the evaluate stage of the process. John, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think also, Matt, in the iterate stage is a good place where you can look at market data in order to select a particular solution. And or in the seed stage, when you're first setting out to define the problem, you may use market share and other research data to properly frame the problem.
Thanks, John. And that also feeds back to the idea of you have to think of this as a cycle. So it does mean when you get to the iterate stage, which is stage 7, you're not done. You may go back and redo the seed stage. You may decide that the problem you originally set out to solve is valid. This whole thing needs to be thought of as a sort of discovery and learning process with the idea that you're not going to do it forever, of course. You do need to come out with a product. Greg?
We have time for a couple of more questions, but I also noticed that we did have a couple of people who just entered the session. Maybe you got the time wrong from the time zone differences, but just to let you know that we have recorded this session, and we will be sending to everyone who's participated a link to where you can also view this webinar afterwards. All right, my next question comes from Richard, and he says, could you share an example of this process successfully applied to an internal business unit, such as in a large insurance company?
Well, I can't cite one specifically to an insurance company. I can cite several that have been done for financial services, which would be, I guess, the next level out. And, for example, I've seen a financial services company try to answer the question that was one of the problems John actually mentioned. Currently, we derive 50% of our revenue, or more than 50% of our revenue, from a particular product, and I'm not at liberty to say what that product is. What is the product of the future? That is, 5 years from now, where will our revenue be coming from? What kind of products should we be offering? What should we be thinking about in the future? And they used the design thinking process to go out and do that, and they came back with an incredible number of really innovative ideas for doing that.
Right, and this will be the last question, comes from Manisha Fadke, and she says, how can this methodology be used to build a company vision or a business model?
Wow, what a great question. John, I'm going to let you ask you to chime in on this as well, but I think that's one of the best things about design thinking is to develop a common vision. As we said earlier, key people throughout the organization participate in this. That is, you actually might have your CEO or the head of your division, as part of the team. And that person is going to go out and do the research with you and come up with prototyping ideas. And so is the marketing guy, and so is the person who's in charge of quality assurance. And all the other key disciplines that are part of your company are going to be there. So talk about, creating a shared vision. There's nothing better than having all, let's say, 7 of you sit there in front of the same customers, take the same feedback from those customers to develop a joint vision of what needs to happen. John, do you have a...
I would only build on that and say, in addition, it offers those that build the vision to see the tripod of constituents, i.e. to go out and visit with shareholders, customers, and employees to generate a comprehensive vision that serves all those stakeholders.
All right, very good. We have reached the end of our time today, so I'd like to give big thanks to Matt and John for sharing their time and experiences with us. Just another reminder that we will be emailing to each of you a link to an online evaluation form for this session, and we ask that you forward that link to anyone in your group who participated in today's call. We know a number of you may have other people in the room with you listening as well, and that email will include a link to where you can download a PDF copy of today's slide presentation, as well as where we will have our access to the recording of today's session as well for you to experience it again later or share with others. Again, thanks to our speaker today and to each of you attending today's call, and we hope to see you again at a future Management Roundtable event. Goodbye and have a wonderful day.